Unscripted Podcast with Rosabel, the place where genuine conversations meet inspiring stories, personal growth, and a dash of humor. I'm Rosabel, your host, inviting you to embrace life's unpredictable journey. Celebrate your unique story and find joy in everyday moments. Get comfortable, stay curious, and let's explore together. Unscripted, unapologetic, and unstoppable. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Life Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Rosabel Zohfeld, and today's guest is truly remarkable. Her name is Laura Vosika. She joins us. She's a mother of 10. She's an author, musician, podcast host, publisher, and the dynamic force behind the Glenmirril Farms, where she lives. And by the way, her life is beautifully reinvented with sheep, rabbits, chickens, lush gardens. Laura's life story embodies resiliency, courage, and the power of writing your own destiny. So I believe this episode promised deep insight and heartfelt inspiration. So grab your favorite drink, get cozy, and let's dive into this incredible conversation. Laura, welcome to the Life Unscripted. I am absolutely thrilled that you are here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's 5 o'clock, but all I have is water.
So you are an author, musician, podcast host, farmer, and above all, a mom of 10. Yes. Wow, that is incredible. Can you share
how journey?
That's exactly what I was about to ask about your journey. How did it all begin? What led you to embrace such a diverse and enriching path?
Well, where do I even start? It actually, I guess the 10 children started with the fact that when I was supposed to be confirmed Catholic, I refused to because they were really not teaching faith well in those days. And I got to that point and said, I have no idea what the difference is between Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, whatever. And I need to know that before I agree to anything. And so after some research, when my oldest son was born, when I was 20, I hadn't gone to church in a few years. And I said, you need to raise kids to know that there's something bigger than themselves. You do need to raise them with faith, in my humble opinion. And so we started going back to church. I continued to research what various faiths teach and thought about what do I really believe. And so I had been raised what I call cafeteria Catholic. We kind of pick and choose which parts we want to believe. And so I won't go through the whole steps of logic, but I'm a very logical person. I often say I think I'm missing part of the female DNA because I really don't like shopping. And I'm extremely logical. And I know, that's an ugly stereotype that women aren't, but, it's a joke. And so through a series of logical steps, I said, I think that this is the place where I belong. And then I met my friends, Dale and Mickey. And they said, well, there are 55,000 branches of Christianity. You can be anything you want to be. So why don't you be what aligns with what you actually believe? And if you want to be a Catholic and you think it's the right faith, then you need to live like a Catholic. Well, that's a hard teaching in our day and age. And I said, okay, well, I can't see a reason to leave the Catholic faith, so I'm going to have to follow all the teachings, including the hard and the scary ones. And that's how I ended up with 9 kids. I know that supposedly natural family planning works wonderfully. Maybe I didn't know what I was doing, but you know what? I'm really glad. I've always told my kids this wasn't my plan, but it was God's plan. And it turns out I like God's plan for my life a whole lot better than I like what was my plan. To be honest, I thought I'd be lucky if I got married by the time I was 35. And instead I ended up married at the age of 20.
Wow. Me too.
So
I was the same thing. I'm lucky I got married at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought that I would have a hard time meeting someone. I was perhaps not very outgoing in high school, not very comfortable with people. And a lot of that changed once I left home. Now, as far as the music, I would say, again, I'm going to go back to, I guess, ideas of faith and God. I think all of us are born for certain things. And I think I was born to be a musician and a writer. I've always wanted to do both. And so I started organ lessons in second grade. And my mom chose organ because we were in the military, so we moved a lot. And it's easier to haul one of those little, I forget what they were called, the Kimball electric organs that were popular in the 70s. It was easier to cart those around than a piano. And I hated the organ. And I didn't like my teacher. My teacher didn't like me. And so she ended up telling my mother, it's badge of honor. She told my mother, this is the most stubborn child I've taught in 25 years. And she kicked me out of organ lessons. And so a few years later, my grandfather actually played trombone and his twin sister played violin. And he showed us, the grandkids, his trombone, and it was just this beautiful instrument that's about 100 years old right now. And it was silver and it had all this floral engraving all up and down the bell. Just absolutely gorgeous. And he let us try it. And so at the age of 11, I told my parents I want to play trombone, and they had not forgotten the organ lessons. And they said, you have to stick with it for a full year. So by my junior year in high school, when I'm talking about majoring in music, they were like, you have to stop this. You can't do that. And it's like, well, you've told me literally the first words you ever said to me the day I was born were, you're going to college and you're paying for it yourself. And I said, if I'm paying for it, I'm getting the degree that I think I need to get. And so I did major in music, and I had an absolute blast, playing in pit orchestras for ballet companies, for community theater, for orchestras, symphonies, same thing. I've played in a few different jazz bands, I think maybe just two. So I was part of the Buzz Whiteley Big Band out in Poulsbo, Washington. I believe Buzz is now in his 90s and still directing that jazz band. So he's an incredible man. But I had the incredible honor. I lived in Bremerton, Washington, just above the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard where the USS Missouri was parked. And I'm trying to remember what year it was, maybe about 2002, somewhere in there. Hawaii and Washington State had a big battle over who would get to house the USS Missouri. And in my way of seeing it, Hawaii won and they took our ship. But the great part about that was they asked the Buzz Whiteley Big Band to play Old Lang Syne on the Dock as it sailed past. And it was just, this is what I love about music. I have had so many wonderful experiences, and it was incredible to be there at a historic moment, to turn around and see just literally hundreds upon hundreds of sailors in their dress whites all lining the deck as it pulled out. So let's see, music. And I think the other thing is the publishing. I got started in that because around 2009, I think, maybe a little later, we got a new member in my night writers group, and he was really pushing the idea of self-publishing because he said the publishers are going to make you give them most of the royalties, but they expect you to do most of the work of marketing anyway. So why not get most of your royalties and self-publish? But at the same time, it really wasn't accepted in that year the way it's become much more acceptable. And so what we did was we created a publishing co-op for all the writers in our writers group. I bought the ISBNs. I think they paid to set up a site, which I didn't like, so I later changed it. But I bought the ISBNs in bulk, and all of a sudden I had other people outside the group coming to me, and I don't even know how the first ones found out about me. But it's like, well, if people want me to publish and if I like the book, it's why not? So, and then finally the farm. The farm is the result of 2020. And it was, I'm sure for many people, a very terrifying year. It sounds kind of silly in comparison to what some people suffered, but I'll say it's really scary to have all of a sudden, I think I had 7 of my kids at home because the college son was sent home from college. The teenagers weren't able to go to high school anymore. Few of my adult kids had been living with me. And all of a sudden, I had 7 or 8 people in the house and we couldn't find toilet paper. And, minor problem in a way, except with that many people, it could be a huge problem. But, I said, my husband did too. We said, next time it's going to be food. I mean, I wasn't married to him yet at the time, but we both said it's going to be food next time. And we decided, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't, but it's not wise to sit around and just, hope. Hope is not a plan. And so let's see, September 2021, we embarked on our learning mission. We got a house in Duluth at the time on, I believe it was 29 acres. And we started learning how to grow a garden. And I'd never grown a garden in my life. And when I was pretty sure I could keep a head of lettuce alive, we got chickens. And I started researching and I started to think, my gosh, you've got to have a PhD in animal husbandry to take care of chickens. I mean, it's intimidating when you start reading all this stuff. And I found out, of course, it really isn't that hard. When I kept the chickens alive for a few months, I said, okay, we can move on up to rabbits. So we got some New Zealand white rabbits. They are both for meat and fur. And after we moved to Tennessee, which we did because our taxes got increased so high in Minnesota, we're like, yeah, we can't afford this. We both work from home. And so we moved to Tennessee. And about a year and a half ago, we got our first 4 sheep. And so that herd increased. It would have been 15, except one of the little lambs jumped in the water tank and drowned. So we had a flock of 14, and we just last night had our very first meal of ground lamb meatballs that we raised on our own land. So it's been an exciting adventure, but that is how all of those things began.
Wow, that is an amazing, incredible story. Laura, so you mentioned that you put yourself through college at age 18, right? And going back a little bit, also you you grew up in an alcoholic family, is that correct?
My father was technically diagnosed as a dry drunk, which means he's not like an alcoholic that can't stop drinking. He can stop drinking anytime he likes, but there are a lot of dynamics in such a family. And so that's what was going on, were typical alcoholic family interactions dynamic, even if it wasn't active, falling down drunk or anything like that.
That is amazing. And then also there's the storytelling where it's clearly a major theme in your life. Like you mentioned, you're not only an author, but also the founder of, is it Gabriel's Horn Press?
Gabriel's Horn.
Oh, Gabriel, sorry. And then, I have a cousin and his name is, but I say in Spanish, Gabriel, sorry.
Oh, okay.
So that's why. But yeah, so can you kind of bring us back or tell us how is that the act of writing, which I had perhaps an idea, but I want to know for you, how is the act of writing and sharing stories being a part of your healing process and personal growth?
Well, when I've actually been writing probably since I was 8 years old, almost since I was able to write. And at one point, my first husband said, you're spending too much time writing. There were a lot of issues there. I'm not going to go into them. But he said, the problem is that you're spending too much time writing. So I said, okay, fine. For the sake of the marriage, the kids, I'll set it aside. And lo and behold, I found out that the problems didn't go away. And so I finally came to a very dark place in my life. I was kind of being hit from all sides, a lot of criticisms that I think were unjust, even in retrospect, because I'm willing to look at myself. I've always been very willing to say, am I part of the problem? How am I part of the problem? We need to do that. It's vital to have good relationships. But when you keep looking and looking and looking and you keep being told, no, you're still the problem. And I finally said to my first husband, am I ever right? Are you ever wrong? And he said, nope. And I'm like, yeah, that's not true. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Like I said, I was in a very dark place. I guess I'll say this for the sake of anyone else who's been there. I woke up every morning thinking, I don't want to be alive. I can't continue. I feel worthless. I feel like a horrible person because I had both the family dynamics and my now ex-husband, just piling on me. And I don't want to say, well, it's a blessing in disguise, I guess, which is a horrible thing to say, but I had a friend in high school whose mother committed suicide. And that's a very powerful image to see your friend at her mother's graveside. And I said, I'm not going to do that to my kids, but I have to figure out a way to go on. And so, first of all, I started a bucket list. I started a gratitude list, made myself find 10 good things every day. And it was pretty terrible. I mean, I've obviously have a lot of interests. I like to study languages in addition to all of that. And I looked at this bucket list and said, I don't even know what I want out of life anymore. I've forgotten who I am. And, but I said, wait a second, I've always wanted to write a novel. So I'm going to practice gratitude every day. I'm going to write a novel. And if I still feel this awful after I've written a novel, well, we'll make a decision then. Obviously, I didn't expect I'd still feel that awful. I was pretty sure that would change things, and it did. And, I think it's cathartic in part because for me at the time, I was literally just stepping into a different world. And I often joked, I was happier in my medieval dungeon with Neil than in my real life, except, of course, my real life changed because I started changing and deciding, I believe in personal responsibility. I believe hugely in it. It's one of the few things we have in this world, really. And I was having a hard time in life at that time. And my daughter one day was upset, saying, I don't know who I'm going to come home to. And I'll still say, with all the things going on around me, it's no wonder that I was a little bit moody. But I said, you know what? I can't make excuses. And that's why I started writing. I started the gratitude list and said, for my children's sake, I have to do better no matter what anybody else is doing to me. I have to be the wall where it stops. And so in addition to that, but I think you gain a lot of confidence when you start this writing process, when you step into another world. There's this act of creating characters where I think it can be healing because as you get into these people in your book, some of them are not very nice people, especially in my book. Well, probably in everybody's book. Sean is a very terrible person when we first meet him. He's got his good points. He's very charismatic. He's a brilliant musician. He is a brilliant businessman who double majored in music and business. And he's made this orchestra this phenomenal success. But on the other hand, he's a complete womanizer. He's a jerk. He takes advantage. He cheats on his girlfriend. He has wild parties. He's going to get the orchestra in trouble because when they go on tour, he leaves damage in the hotels they're at with his wild parties. But as you start to get into, I started to think, well, he can't stay like this, obviously. And that's what happens when he ends up in medieval Scotland. He doesn't have his fame and his money to get him out of trouble anymore. And he starts seeing how I behave has real impact on people and I have to change. But as I kind of went through that process of there are reasons why people are the way they are, I can look at everybody in my life who has done things to me that are unjust, and we all have people like that. And I can understand, I think I know some of the things in their past that led them to where they are. And that's where you find forgiveness and just the ability to say, it's broken people and they're going to do things because they haven't figured out how to heal themselves. And so
Absolutely.
I guess, yeah,
Hurt
those are a
people,
few
hurt
ways.
people.
Exactly.
So something came to mind while you were talking about your story. Like in my case, for example, there's a lot of things that resonated with me that I can relate with. You mentioned having a friend in high school who lost her mother. Perhaps it could have been that friend. I was 17 when I lost my mom. also grew
Mhm.
up with an alcoholic father. So many things in there. And then you talk about that ex-husband. That's one of those that I don't talk about. And I
Mhm.
also lived through a situation like that where I live with someone who just like that. The other day I was even because I chose not to bring to memory the
Mhm.
hurtful words that he will say, all the negativity. I can't even repeat the names that this man will call me, right? And that's interesting because very seldom I actually talk about this. It's like a part of
Mhm.
my life that I don't know why. Maybe because I don't know exactly what's the psychology behind it. I wrote a book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called, have it right here. It's called The Courage to Succeed, a True American Dream.
Okay.
And it talks about my
Mhm.
life growing up in Colombia and all that. And what's interesting, though, I'll tell about my life. But when it comes to that part, my first marriage, I just literally write in the book, okay, I don't even say my first marriage, say, well, that's something I will talk later about. Because for some
Mhm.
reason I still haven't been able to, still don't know in my mind, is it worth sharing it? Is it not? I don't know. The point here is I ask you the question, how is writing part of the healing process and all that? Well, okay, there's the writing for us writers because we
Mhm.
get so many things out. That's cathartic. That's great. But also the sharing. When we share, I've started. I believe this. When we share, we not only heal ourselves, but others heal. By
Yes.
you sharing your story, it's bringing up a little heal because a little
Right.
by little the story is coming out. There's certain things that no matter how much we want to get it out or we want to let go, sometimes still remain. That's what we achieve, I believe, by communicating, by sharing with others.
And to me, that's almost the only reason, I've actually only talked about this on one other podcast. And until now, I really haven't because I don't want it to be taken as I'm trying to badmouth anyone. That's
That is
not the point at
exactly
all.
right. That is
The
exactly, I think, one
point.
of the reasons that I didn't want to, never want to talk about this part. Because also the other thing is, I started thinking, well, the story is, it's my story. It's not their story. I don't want to talk about necessarily them. But at the same time, there are certain things that they did, how it affected us.
Mhm.
But who knows, right?
And that's why I'm not going to talk about specifics. My kids have a good relationship with their dad, and I think that's vitally important. In many ways,
Yes.
he was a very good father to them. He was not a good husband to me, but he was a good father, very active and involved in their lives. He held a job, he supported them. He did a lot of
Yes.
things right, and I'm going to give him credit for that. And I want them to have a good relationship with him. And for the most part, I think they do. So I don't go into specifics, but
Yes.
there are.
And same way I feel this person, there is also good. There's a lot of good in it. And for many reasons, he's the person who actually, because of him, as I made it to America.
Mhm.
So it's
Yeah.
very, very interesting.
Well, ironically, it's because of me that he made it to America. He's actually from Ireland. So, the kids still go to Ireland, see their grandparents over there, and I think it's been really good for them.
Very good. Very good. You also have a podcast.
Yes, I do books and brews, and I forgot to mention how that started. It's actually kind of a funny story. I briefly had a publicist. I'm sure that you, as an author, get just dozens of private messages and emails a week offering to sell you services. Normally, I ignore those, but I got one from Dina Rose years ago. For whatever reason, I listened, paid attention. She came across as more sincere, I think. And so she was my publicist for about 2 years, always looking for ways to kind of direct people towards my books. The irony being, it seemed like every time she got me attention, people wanted me to publish their books, not buy mine. And I'm like, well, I'd really rather be an author than a publisher. I can't publish hundreds of books. But she came up with the idea of books and brews, and she contacted a radio station in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and she did some research online and found Minnesota's first beer cicerone, Michael Agnew. And I think most people aren't familiar with the term beer cicerone, but it's like a wine sommelier, but for beer. And so it was a relatively new thing. I think this is late 2016, that she contacted him. And he wrote some articles on beer for the Minneapolis Star Tribune, things like that. And so she got the agreement from the radio station, and then she called him out of the blue and said, "Hi, would you be interested in doing this thing really early in the morning?" And I've kind of teased him. If someone said that to me, I wouldn't even say anything. I'd hang up on them. I don't do really early in the morning. But he agreed to it. We met and we did 6 months at this radio station. However, they had a very interesting way. They charged me to provide them content. And I said, well, that's interesting. I'll do it for a few months to get some, to get out on the airwaves, to get the program known, to get some experience. And it was a great experience. But after that, we said, we're not going to keep paying to provide you content. And so then we did it at Barnes and Noble for 4 months. Michael hated that because they made him choose from the 6 beers they had on tap. They actually had like a little cafe within the bookstore. And that sort of defeated the purpose, where he takes the reading, the author sends us the 3 readings, and he pairs a beer to the author's reading. And so we did that briefly, and then we set up the podcast. And I think we started the podcast, I want to say April of 2019. COVID, I think, was a large part of caused some upheaval in Michael's life, and he's now also taking care of elderly parents. So now my husband is actually my co-host, and he pairs cocktails to authors' readings. So it's a fun way to talk about books with a little bit of a fun twist to it.
That is incredible. That's very unique, very original. I like it. I like the idea.
We've had a
Laura,
lot of fun with it.
I bet. So, Laura, I can see clearly that resiliency is a cornerstone of your life. I mean, So for our listeners who might be feeling perhaps overwhelmed, what would be some practical advice that you would give them to take that very first step toward reclaiming their own narrative?
I think gratitude is huge. That really changed my life. And as I've said, I was in a very, very dark place at the time. And I had to start with, look, there's snow kind of dancing in front of the spotlight over Walmart. It's actually quite beautiful. But all of a sudden, no matter how dark your life is, when you start finding the good in it, you'll find that you find more and more good. I think the decision to take personal responsibility, to say, I am where I am. I can't control people around me, but I can control myself. So I'll go back to why. Well, I mean, I sort of was told from the start I would be putting myself through college anyway, but I expected at least to have a home to come home to in the summer. And among the alcoholic dynamics was that when I got home after my freshman year, I was repeatedly threatened with, I'm going to kick you out. And it wasn't anything I was doing. I was working 30 hours a week. I was practicing my trombone another 10 or 12 hours a week, mostly just stayed in my room. So there were other things going on why I was being blamed for things I couldn't control. And at a certain point, again, just like our decision to have the farm, are you going to sit back and wait to be a victim, or are you going to figure out how to deal with life, with things that you can't control? So this was way before Google, way before the internet. Somehow or other, researching at the library, I found that there was actually a way to legally emancipate yourself from your parents. And it did involve, and the reason this was important was because my father was a military officer. Any loans or grants I could get would be based on his income, not on my income. And so I went through this process of legal emancipation. It did involve getting affidavits from family members that we weren't just saying this to get, loans on my income. It went through, and I was able to get the loans and grants I needed to continue college on my income. And so I'm trying to think, let's see. So the next summer, well, the rest of the summer before my sophomore year, I got housing at the college. The next summer, I ended up in Boston, and that's how I ended up meeting my ex-husband. And then after that, we were in married student housing. And so that's how I put myself through college. But it all goes back to having the mindset of saying, I don't want to be a victim. I'm not a victim. I have control over my own life, and I'm going to figure out how to make it work.
Absolutely. That is the way to do it. The best one, by the way.
Yep.
Laura, yes, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I actually know from one of the forums, and again, to mention the forum would be to tell details that I'm not going to tell. But in trying to cope with some of these issues, I was on a forum where one of the other women had 8 children at the time. And there were reasons that she had no choice but to leave her husband. She made it work. And I've always been in awe of her. I made it work when I had no children. She had 8, and she moved, I believe it was from Alaska to Seattle, somehow got herself back into school with 8 kids. And I don't think she'd ever had an income of her own before that because she was home with the kids. So it's truly amazing when you start hearing some of these stories, and it inspires you to go, you know what, if she can do it, I can do it. If he can do it with, I don't know, no legs or no arms or whatever. I mean, look at Tony Melendez. He has no arms, and yet he plays guitar so well. Of him, he played for the Pope. I've seen him perform in person, and he plays with his toes, and it's amazing. It's not like, yeah, it's pretty good for a guy playing with his toes. It's like he's an amazing musician.
Yes, so many amazing, incredible people out there. So many stories that we can learn from. My own grandmother, my mom's mom, she had 14 children, but of course, born 1926 or something like that. And I guess 11 of them survived, and then so on. But she also had to leave her husband. And she did it so her kids could be educated and moved. And she literally educated each one of them by sewing a little machine, and things of that nature. So those are the things that definitely, inspire you. And that's when you go and you say, if she could do it, I can do it. And that's why it's so important to share our stories, to read, to learn about other people's lives and perspectives, because it can shed so much life into ours. So absolutely. Laura, before we wrap up this inspiring conversation, can you please share how our listeners can connect with you and perhaps learn more about your incredible work?
Yes, I have many URLs, many websites. My main one is lauravosika.com. That's V as in Victor, Osika. My publisher's website is gabrielshornpress.com. Books and Brews is books and brews, all spelled out.net. I think the one I'm missing is Glenmirril Farms. I didn't feel like paying for yet another website, so that's Glenmirril Farms at wordpress.com. And you can see pictures of our sheep and our rabbits. And I don't keep it updated very often, but there's some articles about, for instance, the most recent one is eucalyptus, because I just planted eucalyptus seeds. Some articles on medicinal herbs, I think, is in there, things like that. And I believe almost all of those have both Instagram, Facebook, and only Gabriel's Horn has a Twitter account. And some of those, we took what was available, but you can always find the links on the sites.
Absolutely. Well, and then there's one question I have for you. How do you like living in Tennessee?
I like it. I find the people here wonderful. I think it's been a little bit of hard adjustment psychologically, mentally, only because it wasn't a free choice. We were put in a position where they literally increased our taxes by 50% overnight. Well, where's the money coming from? And so we kind of felt like we didn't really have any choice but to leave. And It's a little harder when you feel like this was forced on you. I also had 2 surgeries right about the time, emergency surgeries. So I kind of almost got here on a pallet in the back of an ambulance. It wasn't quite that bad, but darn close. But as I've settled in, the land, I'm looking out the window right now. We have 21 acres here. It's about half woods, half fields. It's beautiful. I have found that I thought I would really, really miss winter and snow. I have not at all, which surprised me. But we get spring is coming in February, which up in Duluth, I sank into snow up to mid-thigh in mid-April. And I stood there for like 3 minutes saying, I have nothing to grab onto. How am I going to get out of this? So you get these exciting survival tales in northern Minnesota that I'm not going to get here. But
Right.
I haven't missed the snow or the cold. The land is beautiful, and I have found the people so warm and friendly down here. They're really wonderful.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Well, so the listeners, don't forget to connect again with Laura. She has an incredible story. I myself am going to be looking more into your books, your press, your farm. I want to look at those animals. Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners? Anything that perhaps I'm not asked you, or something that you want to leave them with?
Yes, 2 sayings. Somewhere along the way, I came across the line, be the author of your own story. And I think that's very motivating. The Catholic Church has the idea of start from the end, which means you think about how you want to die. What do you want people to say about you when you're gone? How do you want to face God and say, did I use my time well? Or, as one of my classmates in high school put it in his thing at the end of the year book, was be a part of your own destiny. And I think those are such powerful words.
Yes, we do have the power to write our own destiny for sure. It's good when we know that nothing is written in stone, because that gives us power to reframe, and especially to reframe those negative things, whether it's the genetic part, the environment, whatever it is that we think is going to take our life away. But in essence, life is beautiful no matter what. Thank you so very much for sharing your life story. I mean, what a
Thank you.
journey. I mean,
Thank you for having me.
thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time. Take care. I want to invite you, yes, you listening right now, to check out my book, The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream. It is available now on Amazon and also Barnes & Noble. This is a story of resilience, grit, and what it really means to chase your dreams, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you ever face fear, failure, or uncertainty, this book will meet you right there and remind you that courage always has a voice. Just search The Courage to Succeed: A True American Dream by Rosabel Zohfeld on Amazon, or head to the link in the show notes, because your dream is worth it and your courage can take you there.